This is the fourth in a session of events that have been organised by NPC, specifically focusing on trustees, although we obviously welcome people who are not trustees as well. And we're particularly looking today on retaining and empowering volunteers through and beyond COVID-19. We've got a great group of speakers from a range of backgrounds, which I'll go through briefly in a moment. But I also want to just thank the cloth workers who sponsor these sessions and who've been very committed to developing and supporting trustees through this NPC programme. I just want to say personally, I'm very pleased to be here. I'm one of the trustees at NPC, and I have a background. I used to run a volunteering organisation now called Volunteering Matters, and you'll be hearing a bit more about that later on. But like quite a lot of people, I'm also doing quite a lot of volunteering at the moment as a vaccine steward and other things. So like a lot of people, of course, I think it's also important to remember that trustees themselves are volunteers. So I think we've all got a stake in this game, which I think is what makes it particularly important. Just a few bits and pieces. You can see on the screen, I hope, that the session's being recorded, that we will be very keen for you to respond to the post-event survey, because we're always trying to improve how we do things at NPC, and to also say that some people are doing it, but do keep introducing yourselves on the chat. Perhaps I'll briefly just explain the format and then just give a little bit of introduction. So I'm going to say a few words at the beginning just to sort of set the scene. We have 3 speakers. Hopefully they're all going to be really tough on their time. So they have 10 minutes each. And after each one, I'll give a chance for very brief questions if you want to spell out any things that aren't clear or something you particularly want to ask that speaker. So after the 3 speakers, we will have a breakout session, which will be a chance for people to network in smaller groups and to identify if there are any particular issues they want to take further, but also if they want to share experiences amongst themselves. And I'll introduce that a bit later on. Then finally, we'll come together and take questions across the whole panel of speakers. And we will finish by 6 o'clock. So you can all definitely go offline then and have a bit of relax and whatever. So that's the format. I hope that makes sense to everybody. I think it's a very, the subject matter is a very, very apposite one to the times we're in. There's been an enormous spotlight on volunteers through the pandemic, which I suppose is now a year old. And it's covered a whole range of different types of volunteering and different sorts of ways in which people have engaged, from the very, very immediate people literally just helping their neighbours with shopping or going to the chemist or whatever, to mutual aid groups which are set up in, both streetwise and then sort of more local community-wise, through to volunteering with organisations that already had volunteers, to volunteers joining up with organisations that had never had volunteers before, to obviously the very mass volunteering that was organised through NHS responders and others nationally, St John's and others. And this variety of volunteering has meant that it has both been a variety of people who have volunteered, which has always been the case, but possibly there's a sense that a much wider range of people are volunteering than before. And one of the things I think we're going to hear about is how true that is and what that means. I also think the other thing we're going to hear about is both the ways in which technology can help, but the ways in which some of the basics about volunteering, technology doesn't sort all of those out. And we need to make sure that we do things that are complementary, and thinking that the technology will be the only answer to getting more people engaged. I think the other thing that, of course, has come through is that we're actually dealing with people in many difficult and fraught situations, people who are going through very difficult times. And there are very important issues around safeguarding, about the welfare of the volunteers, about the ways in which you can give consistency, and also ensure that, in a sense, volunteers are being as effective as they can be. One of the worst things I've both heard from and experienced myself of being a volunteer is feeling that what you're doing is pointless, or that you're waiting around and nothing's much happening. And I think people understand sometimes that you need to wait around, but I do think the notion of how volunteers are supported, deployed, trained, developed is really important. And one of the messages I would always want to give is volunteers give the free of their time, but it is not a free good. You have to provide support to volunteers to get the most effect. Some of that can be volunteers supporting themselves, and there's some wonderful things doing that, but it doesn't just happen spontaneously over time and place. And I suppose one of the things we're all concerned about is how do we capture the best of the volunteering that's going on or has been going on as we move into different phases. I don't think we're yet at the point of saying when the pandemic is over, but as the phases of the pandemic change, how do we ensure that we continue to encourage and recruit volunteers and also support them in different roles? So lots of things we can talk about, and we've got three fantastic speakers that we're going to hear from. They are, just to remind you, they are Paul, Reddish, Nicola Stoya and Tiger Souza. And without more ado, I'm going to ask Paul to start. Paul is the Chief Executive of Volunteering Matters, and the Volunteering Matters supports over 100 volunteering programmes throughout the UK involving 30,000 volunteers. Paul is currently chairing the National Volunteering Coordination Response, made up of key leaders from both across government and the voluntary sector. And I think that probably hopefully includes local government as well. Prior to his current role, Paul was the CEO of Project Scotland and has held a number of senior roles in the Royal Bank of Scotland Group. As a volunteer, he's a founding trustee of one of Scotland's first community sports hubs, Inch Park Community Sports Club in Edinburgh. So Paul, over to you. I don't know if you're in Edinburgh now, but welcome.
Thanks, Lucy. I am in Edinburgh, yeah, which is quite interesting actually as we move out of restrictions, hopefully. And I'm having to remind all of my colleagues in England as they start to get excited about putting meetings in that we're on a bit of a lag up here. So have some sympathy with me as you all start to open up, and I may still well be in my bedroom when you're all meeting face to face. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for allowing me to speak. You've got a couple of really great speakers coming up later, and I think they're going to give a real specific lens on volunteering and sort of community-led groups. So I was thinking about, with the context of all the different areas that we operate in, what might be the best contribution I can make to help set this up. And I get, as was said in the introduction, we ourselves are community-led. We're operating in just over 100 local authorities and several thousand volunteers across everything from social action to mentoring and everything in between. Supporting isolation, loneliness, improving health outcomes. So we get and do community activism from the bottom up in all the different settings that we're in. But I thought what I'd do in this next 9.5 minutes is talk to you a little bit about what we've learned from COVID in the context of our national role, where we've been helping convene aspects of the volunteering part of the emergencies response. And I thought that might be quite a useful way to set up what are the next few speakers, is to lift this up to a helicopter view a little bit and talk to you a little bit more about, well, what is it that we think has happened out of COVID everywhere, and what might that mean for volunteering and what we all need to think about. So if you can take it as a creds check that we have our roots in communities, but for the next 9 minutes, I'm going to step it up to the national level and talk to you a little bit about that. The first thing I want to explore is this point that has been made, and I feel like I have to drag people back every time it's made, which is I hear now it's stated as fact that we've had this huge surge of lots and lots of new volunteers. And I'm not sure yet that's proven to be the case. And as we've looked through things, what we're seeing is that if you look at the raw numbers in things like the Community Life Survey, there has been a modest increase in volunteering. during the pandemic in terms of raw numbers, but it's really difficult to compare what went before with what went after. There's so many unique conditions with COVID, people isolating, the 250,000 people that were volunteering in charity shops stopping volunteering overnight. Even in the context of mutual aid, where people have said, we've had all of these groups pop up, there's emerging evidence to show in a lot of cases there were existing groups that had, were formed out of community sports groups and arts groups and various other things. So even underneath the detail of all of this, there's a question to be answered around, who was already active in their communities and who was engaged. And that's not me saying that we haven't had lots of people coming forward to volunteer during COVID that weren't before. It's just much more analysis that needs to be done before, the statements that are being thrown around about these millions more people out volunteering. I'm not entirely sure that that's can be said that that's truth at the moment. What we can absolutely say, however, is that there's been a huge surge in political and media interest in volunteering. And I think those of us that have been in the volunteering space for some time have definitely felt that over the last year. I have been more popular with having gone from sort of trying to get volunteering on the agenda to constantly being asked by a number of people what more volunteers can do in context X. It's been a complete turnaround of anything I've known about in the last 10 years. And that sort of surge of political and media interest, to be honest, at times is coupled with a lack of understanding in what's required to do it well. And that's been a real challenge during this crisis, is trying to sort of explain, in the context of big complex systems, that volunteers don't just pop up for free in different places, and that training and support that goes into mobilizing them and everything around it, and the infrastructure is critical to people being able to support communities well. So I would say there has been a huge surge, but it's mainly been an interest. And we'll wait and see whether there has been a surge in new volunteers. What I would say is that, the thing that's caused the confusion in this, at the start of the crisis, there was lots, hundreds of thousands of people coming forward wanting to volunteer. But a lot of those people would have been volunteering in other settings that stopped. And I think that's where the confusion in this has come from, is this sort of sense of all hundreds of thousands of people flooding in to be able to want to support during the crisis. And our ability as a sector, when we're already sort of light on infrastructure, to respond to that huge immediate demand at the start of COVID to be able to get everybody involved that wanted to be involved in the crisis. So COVID's created some different conditions, but one thing I can say for certain is that it's accelerated some trends as well. And what I would say is, if you look particularly at the way young people have engaged with volunteering over the last few years in a number of settings, that much more sort of cause-led and activist-led in a lot of the things that they want to get involved in. I'm being quite stereotypical now, but everyone's individual's different. But in terms of a lot of the research, there's a lot more sort of a sense of ground-up entrepreneurial, social entrepreneurial desire to get involved in different things. And when you look at things like community organizing and the constructs of sort of mutual aid and different groups beforehand, there's much more evidence that people are wanting to get involved in the issues that impact their community as individuals and together, than just, or not necessarily in sort of the more formal top-down charity constructs. And the charities that have understood that well have started to reform the way in which they work. And on the title of this particular presentation is around empowering volunteers. And I think that, a lot of us started to work on that pre-COVID, this idea that actually we need to be able to enable people to do the things that matter to them in their community, that link to our cause, as opposed to being, I have a role, come and do this role, I will train you on it, and you will do it in the way that I want you to do it. So I think in this sector anyway, more and more charities are starting to move towards the idea that we can be open to much more flexibility in what those roles do and what people might do in communities. And I think COVID has just accelerated that, to be honest, because we were in the middle of an emergency, people have felt, an immediate need to go and do stuff. And you heard lots and lots of stories through informal groups and local charities of people, setting up different activities, and then charities falling in alongside that. And I hope that acceleration is a good thing for those of us that are trustees and guardians of charities, and that move away from the sort of slightly more Victorian model of top-down charity volunteering, where we define roles, to really understanding what matters to people and how we can help support people to make communities a much better place. And if I was to give one example in a volunteering matters context, we have a program that runs in a number of local authorities called Grand Mentors, which is over 50s supporting care leavers. And in a traditional sense, the volunteer is the over 50 and the beneficiary is the care leaver. And yet in Islington, where that program has run for 10 years, when COVID hit, they all came together and looked at what the needs were in Islington. And that group of 40 or 50 people together, volunteers, beneficiaries, whatever you want to call them, were out supporting the homeless population, a number of other things together. And blurring that line between volunteers and beneficiaries, and thinking of ourselves as communities and what we can do to sort of support each other, and the different issues that exist in front of us, for me, is at the core of the shift that needs to happen in charities. And that's not saying that we need to move away from entirely formal roles, but giving people more agency in how they can support the cause we're all passionate in, and not seeing people just as beneficiaries or volunteers, but just people, is at the heart of, I think, what we can all learn from COVID. There's been some interesting tech developments. There's been lots of conversations, and Lucy set it up in the introduction about tech being important but not replacing the relational things, and that's absolutely right. I would say what's been really interesting is that there's been a number of sort of tech solutions that have really pushed the boundaries on that now, and started to demonstrate to us that you can, with really good, effective tech, go beyond the light touch tech things, and really automate aspects of the way volunteering works, and that helps support getting to the relational aspects. And I've just put two up here: the Good Sam app, which the NHS Volunteers app is founded on Spearhand. The interesting thing about both of these is they intelligently match where the volunteer is, where the need is in their community. And if you think about what that might look like in the context of a volunteer manager, that might look like an email coming in that they then have to respond to, and then find an individual and match them up to the need, or make a phone call. And if that administrative aspect is being sorted out and automated through tech, that does create opportunities for volunteer managers to then do much more proactive work with volunteers and communities. So I don't think we should be afraid of tech, even if it is stepping into the traditional space where volunteers and volunteer managers and the like might talk. We can and should embrace it as an opportunity to look at how we build better and deeper relationships with our volunteers that are not as transactional as, can you please go and do this? I'm going to end on the key lessons that hopefully I've stepped through in the last 10 minutes, and sort of 3 things to take away, or 4 things to take away. The first one is, to really appreciate that the expectations people have of us in the sector is changing, and that we need to move with this. And I've listed some of the things below, but essentially, as I move around talking to partners in the sector, I'm hearing sometimes things like charities say, well, we're trying to build brand loyalty. We're trying to attract people to our brand. We want them to volunteer with our charity. And then if you talk to people that are in around the vaccination centres, and Lucy just mentioned there about marshalling, people are volunteering around the vaccination programme because they want to help us get out of this mess we're in. They're not that interested in whether it's for the British Red Cross or St John Ambulance or Royal Voluntary Service or anyone else for that matter. So I know with the Kruger report, the idea of passporting was introduced, and passporting is not going to be appropriate in every settings, but where a volunteer's expectations on us are that we're going to make it easy for them to do what they want to do, and there are multiple agencies involved, how we're able to support that is going to be really critical. And that blurring of the lines between multiple agencies and charities involved in settings where an individual expects to give their time, and for us to make that easy, this is becoming a really important fundamental thing. We've got to strip away the boundaries and the lines that we put up in the sector that might be barriers to doing that. We have to move from being a deliverer to an enabler, and I've just described the example there in Islington. rather than seem to be delivering support for a group, how can that group be enabled to activate in their own community? How can we blur the lines between the two in order to serve our missions? And then, part of that is working within the system to change it for the better of communities. So if I take the Islington context, we are commissioned in order to support those care leavers with positive outcomes. But that doesn't mean we can't use those relationships to help do more in that community and help people build agency locally. So sometimes systems and commissioning set up to prevent us from doing that place-based work in terms of how commissioners work. It doesn't have to stop us thinking about that, and it doesn't have to stop us thinking about how we can enable the community of volunteers around us to do what they want to do in their communities. So I hope that's a very whistle-stop tour. I could have spent an hour and 10 minutes on this topic. I've rattled through it. I hope it was useful, and I look forward to any questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul. I don't know if there's any specific questions in the chat, and I'm keen that we keep the debate going on, but I think there is one question, which is, where is the, the question is there a volunteering skills passport to motivate staff development, retention and progression? So I don't know if you got a response to that, Paul, or in general, if you wanted to tell us where the kind of passporting has got to. I mean, I'm slightly worried that some of it becomes in itself a kind of an elaborate process of trying to work out how the passport works, rather than the principle behind it, which is the flexibility of people being able to work between different organisations.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I would say on passporting is the organisational barriers to making it work are complex. Because if you think about the things that we would need to sort out, we would need to recognise each other's training. In the context of things like safeguarding, that's not a small thing to do. It's to make sure that you're comfortable that if somebody's trained somewhere else, they have all of that skills and you've got the risk covered to be able to take that on. And that's just one example of many things. So I don't think passporting should be done unless there is an absolutely compelling reason to do it because of the barriers that are involved. And for me, it's really simple. The compelling reason is the example I've just described. If volunteers themselves have that expectation on us as a sector, to enable them to be able to respond in a particular area in that flexibility, there's a case for it. If volunteers don't see it as a priority, I'm not sure we should be seeing it as a priority. So, I think the case for passporting rests on that. I don't see it as a sector-wide national thing in every setting. That's my view.
Good. Okay. Well, we may want to pick that up later on, but I think that's helpful. I think it's not the be-all and end-all, but that it's that notion of the flexibility that people can take their skills, and if the role's similar, that they can take it from one organisation or one scenario to another. I think we should move on to our second speaker, who's going to talk, I think, rather more specifically around her experience with a particular community organisation, interestingly enough, actually in Islington. So I'm delighted to introduce Nicola Stoya, who has worked in the voluntary community and social enterprise sector for over 20 years. She's currently managing director of the School for Social Entrepreneurs, which helps people develop the skills, strengths and networks they need to tackle society's biggest problems. Nicola is also a trustee with the Institute for Voluntary Action Research and United St Saviour's Charity. And of course, she's a trustee and on the board of Help on Your Doorstep, which she's going to be talking about with us today, which focuses on improving the health and well-being of people in the Borough of Islington in London. It works with residents, it seeks to find solutions to the issues which make life difficult, strengthen communities to do more for themselves, and enable people to improve their life chances. Nicola, I think it's a fantastic organisation. I know a bit about it because I actually happen to live in Islington. Do tell us a bit more. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Lucy. And hi, everyone. Really great to be here today. I'm just going to share my screen. I've got some slides as well. Don't want to spend too long telling you about Help on Your Doorstep, but just to say a little bit by way of background. As you've heard, Islington-based charity, established in 2009, growing out of a project initially from the New Deal for Communities area. And we work across Islington. We've got paid staff who are based throughout the borough. And in terms of our aims, so Lucy's given you a little idea there, but really we're working with quite vulnerable and isolated people. And we have a model which is called a Connect service, where we literally go to their doorstep, help on your doorstep, to say, what can we help with? And we do that very openly. The types of issues that typically come up: welfare benefits, debt, housing support, not so much more recently because of those more immediate needs, but sometimes employability support, training support, and so on, energy, like a whole range of things. And then we connect them. We've got a referral partnership with about 150 plus local organisations to connect them into the services or support that they need. And then we do a bit of follow-up to check that that's happening. And then the other thing that we do within community settings is what we call a Good Neighbour scheme, which is very local activity-based work, often run by and for community members. A few other things thrown in the mix as well, a bit of community research sometimes, and we're also linked in with the GPs around a social prescribing service. But just wanted to give you a little bit of a flavour around that. And really today I'm going to sort of, if you like, tell the story of Help on Your Doorstep and its involvement in volunteering and with volunteers through the COVID-19 kind of year that we've had. So how have we involved volunteers and how have volunteers been involved with us? Well, a whole range of different ways, to be honest. We have increased the role of volunteers in our organisation. We recruited, I think, about 68 additional volunteers. And I think beforehand, so that's over the course of the year, before that, we'd probably put it down to about maybe 20 or so, 20, 25. And the types of things that people have been doing are befriending, and that was a new service that we set up as a COVID response. So telephone support primarily in terms of that befriending, for looking after and looking out for isolated residents, which we knew was going to be a big issue. We were already addressing isolation through our work. We knew that when the lockdown hit in particular, that would be significant. A lot of things have come from that. So we offer practical support and we connect people into practical sort of services anyway. So some of those befrienders have been supporting with shopping, medical prescriptions, dropping things off to people that are unable to leave their homes. Continuing to connect people into services and support. So alongside our paid members of staff, helping people to find their routes through, navigate the system essentially, which can be really, really confusing for people, even more so in times of sort of high anxiety and so on. We have been involved with the vaccination support and the rollout of that in Islington. We've worked alongside some other organisations to do that. So scheduling, training people, helping to coordinate where people need to go, if you like, to kind of support with the real kind of operational side of that, as well as the people to kind of to be there to lend that hand. And then the last kind of couple of things, sort of outdoor events and activities and community research. I guess these are the things that in particular prior to the pandemic, we were working with volunteers on. So when we could unlock a little bit in the summer months, our Good Neighbour scheme projects in particular run a whole range of activities. So we involve volunteers in facilitating and supporting and seeing what people wanted to do there at a local level, usually neighbourhood level, within people's estates and so on. And that's all sorts of things, you know, gardening and outdoor keep fit classes and, you know, like all sorts of things like that. And then community research is something that Help on Your Doorstep will often do for organisations, be it the council or the not primary care trust, that's old school, CCG, and others who want to find out where the community is at on issues or to understand more about what's happening. And because we've got a very strong outreach and very high levels of trust, if you like, between the organisation and the communities it's seeking to support, we often do that. And we involve some of our volunteers in that aspect, particularly around digital, actually, and aspects around digital inclusion or exclusion in the context of the pandemic and how that was helping or not helping. And that was largely capacity wise, but also because we had a lot of willing volunteers there to help. We've so lots and lots of different things. So cutting across all of those things, giving people access to providing food vouchers, as I say, collecting, delivering medications. We've done things like, I think there's probably about 3 people where we've supported to get access to a TV, because we're now all indoors, and that's what we've all been doing. So so we wanted to support the residents in Islington to have opportunities like that too. I think somebody sourced and delivered a fridge for, and again, tapping into that kind of network of the broader public and third sector organisations in and around Islington to kind of enable that. I've got a little note here at the bottom about sort of helping out and volunteering. And the reason I put that there is, we have, I'd say, recruited and skilled up volunteers to support through this pandemic. But really interesting, just sort of following, I guess, from some of what Paul was saying, a lot of what we do typically through Help on Your Doorstep, particularly through this hyper-local Good Neighbour scheme, is really what we and the people call helping out. And to others, they would term it volunteering. Some of our own workers discovered that if you use the term volunteering, it can be a little bit off-putting because it feels a bit formal. We absolutely skill people up and we make sure all the safeguarding things are covered. But actually what people want to do is very small scale to begin with, supporting and getting involved in their communities to help out. And exactly, that's why people are motivated in large part through the COVID kind of response as well. And some people then want to progress and get more involved. But likewise, the people who help out at one session in for example, the local community group Stay and Play, are then also the following day the participants in the art class that's happening on the estate. So this idea of that sort of reciprocity is really, really important and works very, very well at that local level, we found. This is just one example. I won't dwell on this, but do have a look just from one of our befriending case studies. And the kind of the impact that it can have just by feeling that there's somebody else there, there's somebody to chat to, somebody to kind of give you a few pointers in, if you like. And this guy, his position has kind of sort of changed, if you like, quite significantly just by being connected through one of the early kind of befriending partnerships that we helped to set up. I wanted to just share as trustees a few sort of challenges and then other things to kind of that we're thinking about really, and it'd be interesting to hear what others are dealing with. But recruitment, it's a challenge in the sense that, as I say, we've recruited just under 70 additional volunteers, but we knew that we wanted to increase our existing sort of volunteer or helping out pool, if you like. So we worked with Voluntary Action Islington, the umbrella body locally, and that worked really well. So it wasn't too much of a challenge, and we've got some really strong networks in the borough, but definitely, we had to put a bit of intention behind that, if you like, to crew up. I think a really, really important one is the management and coordination of volunteers. It takes time, it takes capacity, and therefore sometimes takes money, often takes money. And that is important because you also owe it to those volunteers to get it right, to provide enough support, to give the guidance, to deal with any issues that are arising. And for us, what's helped is that we were able to access some COVID funds. And what that meant was that we could increase our staffing capacity around volunteer coordination. I'll come back to that. Integrating with the team. One, I think that's really important anyway for volunteers in any organisation, but also in the COVID context, obviously when working remotely, it's sort of harder, it takes longer to do to get to know people. Sometimes you're sort of straight into the business without the kind of warmth and the getting to know you kind of stages and things like that. So we've been mindful about that. And I know the team have been really kind of working through how to kind of build that sort of initial kind of base, if you like, to make people feel part of the organisation and comfortable going out and volunteering on its behalf. Obviously, the safeguarding trainings and equipping people with the processes and the routes to what do you do if you are concerned and where do you go. And actually, what about if you've heard something or you've been involved in something and you're concerned about that? How do you raise that as a conversation piece? And then obviously retention. I mean, we have had some churn, and I think it's really interesting in the current context that furlough, people that have lost jobs, you know, much more higher incidence of people who are typically working, volunteering for Help on Your Doorstep over the last year than previous. So we have to be ready for the challenge that they won't all be around, and indeed some of them have started to go back and so on. And obviously it's a health pandemic, so people are in and out of good and bad health in physical and mental terms, if you like. So that does mean that there's an ongoing kind of need for balance and management around those things. And then I guess some of those, you know, kind of some of those follow on into the sort of broader considerations, but also there's some of the things that we're starting to think about longer term as trustees and with the team. Is this issue around kind of the cost and time to sustain? So we had a member of the team who, with some of the additional funds that we were able to pull in, turned that into a dedicated volunteer coordinator post. It's been full-time over the last number of months. That funding ends in a couple of weeks, end of March. So we've scuttled around, as you do in a charity, and we've got 2 days a week that we can keep that going on for a while. But we do know that resourcing that post or resourcing that provision is a challenge for us, and it's a consideration. And we feel it's really important that if we're going to continue to work with volunteers at a heightened level, we have to put that investment in to get that right. And if we can't do that, we will have to reconsider what we do around and with volunteers, because you can't do a half-hearted kind of thing. I think there's also a really important kind of set of conversations we're having about what to retain. You know, there was this mass surge of support and, you know, and all hands on deck, and rightly so. But what have we learned, if you like, over that period? And what is playing out to the best strengths of volunteers? And what actually should we be integrating in terms of the staff team? And actually, what else do we need to be feeding back to other organisations in terms of statutory responsibilities or things that others are better placed to pick up? So I don't think we've got to the end of that at the moment, but as a consideration about what we sustain, it's kind of where should that sort of focus be? Where are we adding most value to the volunteers, and where are they best placed to kind of bring their skills and experience into the work and into the community? Safeguarding and support, you know, I feel very confident in how we're going about this, but again, it's just this sort of reflection as like everybody mobilised so quickly, rightly so. Some flexibilities were made, if you like, in terms of hopefully not to safeguarding, but in terms of policies and procedures and those sorts of things. I do think there's a general kind of consideration for trustees just to make sure that we're going back and just checking that all those kind of I's and T's and all the rest of it are dealt with, so that as we're moving ahead, you know, we can be kind of confident that we're well set up, if you like. And then just back to this point around integration as stakeholders, you know, for us, you know, it's really, really important to be valuing volunteers and supporting them and thinking about where they want to go and where they want to add value. And, you know, that's about them being an equal part of the organisation. And ideally in a Help on Your Doorstep context, that's also about, you know, their voice, their input, the shaping of decision making about what we do and where we do it and how we do it and things like that. So what are the structures, what are the systems, what are the frequencies, if you like, but all of those things we should be putting in place, assuming that we're able to kind of carry this forward. Are the types of discussions and thoughts on some of our minds as trustees and as the exec team, if you like. So I think I will leave it there, but just wanted to give you a little overview as to, yeah, some of the kind of activities, and very happy to kind of pick up on any questions that people have.
Thank you very much, Nicola. That was brilliant Cook's tour of the work on Help on a Doorstep, and I think reflects an existing organisation that is very well rooted in its local community, which has been doing in the sort of Paul's image, the sort of community-based volunteering. I mean, I think the interesting question, perhaps for all of us, is you know, taking some of the points that Paul made at the beginning. Do we think that the kind of demography of volunteers has shifted and will it shift again? And I suppose one of the things that I feel very strongly about is this question about reciprocity, that actually people play different roles at different, maybe different days of the week, but also certainly different times of their lives. And one of the things the pandemic's done is to create this enormous sort of uproar. So just in terms of that, could you just say, are there any issues between what you might call the full-time workers who've been trucking along, developing Help on Our Doorstep, and the sort of the newer bunch of volunteers? Has that created some tensions or differences of approach?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think I'd say it's been going well in terms of that sort of integration between staff and volunteers, and I think that's largely because the team have been working with volunteers for a long period, perhaps in a more discreet way, and in particular parts of the service, so particularly the sort of neighbourhood-based activity schemes, whereas some of the other services that Help on Your Doorstep runs, like the community research or the connecting into the kind of key local services, if you like, for advice and support, that's been less volunteer-based. So I think, but it's been managed very well, and I think that's been, there hasn't felt like sort of, issues around that. I think what is interesting, and it's almost the kind of the questions to ask yourself as the organisation, is this sort of the demography kind of thing, and that has shifted. So we've definitely continued to work with the people who've been involved before. So the hyper local, the neighbour looking out for the neighbour, the person volunteering to get the shopping from, the estate across the way, that sort of thing has continued. And that would be our typical volunteers, some of whom would work and some of whom not. But I think we have also got different types of volunteers, if you like, in terms of those typically full-time employees. Now, they may well want to kind of move on and do different things, but actually if they've had, and I think this is sort of like Paul's question really, like if that has been released, if you like, in terms of kind of an interest, they might well not be able to kind of continue to volunteer in the way that they have been as their circumstances change. But what if they do want to in some way? So it's like, how can you think about weaving that interest and that skill in, maybe that's like the times of day, the evenings, the weekends kind of things, but to retain that, because there's huge value in that as well. And actually for Islington, which is a highly sort of disparate borough in terms of its wealth and in its inequalities and so on, there's probably more mixing, if you like, at the moment in terms of the variety of backgrounds that people are involved in, and that brings value in itself in terms of cohesion and so on. So yeah, there's some interesting things there about how you enable that to continue.
That's very interesting, Nicola, thank you. Okay, let's now move on to our third speaker, who's Tiger de Souza, MBE, who has just got a new job title, which is People Engagement Director at the National Trust. Tiger has a wide-ranging career in the not-for-profit sector, working at the Royal Institute for Chartered Surveyors, NSPCC, where he and I first met, and England Netball. He's a passionate advocate for the power and creativity of youth, after spending 5 years in his early career being motivated and challenged by a host of brilliant young people at V Inspired. He's currently a trustee of Akivo and has previously been a trustee of both Volunteering England and the National Council of Voluntary Organisations. And he got his MBE this year, or last year actually, for services to volunteering. So many congratulations on that, Tiger, and over to you.
Thank you, Lucy, and good to be here today. So I work for the National Trust. So we are one of the larger volunteering involving organisations in the UK, but I'm hoping that what I share with you today will be totally translatable irrespective of the size of your organisation. Really great to hear from both Paul and Nicola, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to share some things today that pick up and build on the points that they raised. I'm going to start with a piece of research that was released a decade ago, but is still really relevant for us today. Now, at the National Trust, we are a very traditional volunteering involving organisation, and the large majority of our volunteering roles, in terms of the typology that's shared with you on this screen, fall into that consistent deep bracket. So where people give you a significant amount of time and support on a regular ongoing basis. However, we are starting to see some changes, and looking at our data for 2019, so pre-pandemic, of our 53,000 volunteers that we had, 9,000 of those have been involved with us on a one-off or event-based activity. And the growth of lighter touch, more micro volunteering activity is a trend that we've seen across the sector for a period of time. So it's not surprising to me that there have been so many people that have stepped forward in relation to the pandemic for those time-limited but highly focused roles that will help us to navigate the space that we find ourselves in. We recruit about 4,000 volunteers per year in a normal year. In 2019, 30% of those that we recruited were under 18. So there again is for us an indication that, you know, even though we're an organisation that's traditionally, in terms of our volunteer base, at the older generation, so over half our volunteers are over 64, and our largest cohort of volunteers are our room guides, and 70% of them are over 64. We are starting to see younger generations being keen and eager to engage with us, and it's predominantly around the environmental volunteering that we offer. The reason I've started with this model is because as an organisation, we've recognised and understand that we need to start offering opportunities that go across all 4 typologies that were put forward by NCVO back in 2011. We're very limited at the moment in terms of consistent deep. We do have some consistent light, but there are not enough, you know, irregular light touch one-off volunteering opportunities that we offer that provide people both the gateway to engage with us as an organisation, to make a difference to the things that they care about, and potentially as the starting point for them to move in to something more significant in terms of their volunteering relationship with us. So we have invested in some futures research, and the research that we conducted, if you go to the next slide, please, Rebecca, was conducted in 2018. So we looked at a whole raft of insight to say, what are the trends that are going to be impacting on volunteering over the upcoming decade? So this piece of research was, what are the big ticket items that will significantly impact the world of volunteering, participation and inclusion between 2018 and 2030? What we've seen through the pandemic is actually there has been an acceleration of these trends. And I'm going to pick up 2 of them to talk to you about. So citizenship, what we learned under this was that, you know, not only were people keen and more interested in tackling things closer to home, they were keen on supporting their local community. It mentions the economy here, but there was definitely a growing local focus within it, and it was increasingly becoming call to care. So what we've seen through the pandemic is, you know, people wanting to be materially involved in activities that are happening on their doorstep, and volunteers who may have been grounded, such as Volunteers for Us or for other organisations who haven't been able to engage their volunteers over the past year, have seen those individuals started to pick up other roles, such as, you know, supporting the vaccination programme or supporting organisations like St John in terms of their or the local response to support people who have been isolated or finding challenges in relation to COVID and the pandemic. So we are definitely seeing citizenship grow. We're also seeing a growth in demand for technology. So how do we make it easy for people to give their time and to support? So I will be sharing with you all through the pack that MPC will send out copies of our research videos, and anything that I mentioned today, you'll get a copy of it. So don't worry if you haven't had a chance to jot everything down. I'll make sure you get versions of that. So moving on, there was another piece of research. You'll notice I mention research quite a lot, but it informs a lot of the work that we do, called Time Well Spent. And the points that Paul and Nicola raised at the beginning about, you know, what are the trends that we're seeing in terms of volunteering and what are people looking for, are really brought out strongly through this piece of research. And this wheel that represents the, you know, the 8 core and critical factors in relation to a quality volunteering experience are broken down into more depth and more detail in the full report. But I'm just going to hone in on one of those, and that's flexibility. So thinking about flexible volunteering and blending the time well spent data alongside the data from our futures research, what we are seeing is an increasing demand from people to have opportunities to dip in and dip out. And I'm going to take us back to 2012. And after the Olympic Games in 2012, there was a perception that the Games Maker program was going to lead to this enormous kind of like growth of volunteering on seismic levels, and it never materialized. And I think the reason it didn't materialize is that we fundamentally misunderstood what had driven those people to contribute in terms of the games, and that we automatically assumed that they would jump from something that was very time limited, very focused, very specific around a particular event, and that would immediately translate into people wanting to, you know, become a treasurer or to do another volunteering activity where they are committing their time on a much more consistent, deep basis. So it's important for us, if we want to think about how do you harness those people who might have tried volunteering for the first time through the pandemic, or might have supported an organisation they haven't previously engaged with, to maintain their commitment, think about what drove them to come in the first place. And there is definitely something for me about how you make that initial commitment feel light touch. So one of our biggest challenges is that, you know, our volunteers are amazing. I mean, I've got volunteers who've supported us for 50, 60 years. And we recognise their length of commitment by giving them a pin badge. And they proudly wear their pin badges. And I'm really grateful and glad for our volunteers. But the challenge is that when people come and visit our National Trust places and they see our volunteers proudly boasting their 40, 50, 60 years worth of service on their lapel, their perspective, if they'd considered volunteering for us, is, oh, hang on a minute, if I sign up to volunteer for this organisation, I'm committing myself to a lifetime's worth of engagement. So there is definitely something in that technology space, but also in the types of opportunities that we offer that build on some of the brilliant things that we've seen through the pandemic about keeping it small, keeping it light touch, keeping it flexible, and then building that commitment into maybe something more substantive later on. So I just want to finish off just by talking to you about our volunteering plan at the National Trust. Now, we started to build this 2 years ago. So this is pre-pandemic work. We've looked at it and tweaked it, but we feel that it's still pretty consistent and relevant for today. The three things that we are fundamentally focused on as an organisation is, one, making sure volunteering is seen as being positive. And that's both internally as well as externally. So how do we make sure that staff right across the Trust realise, understand, celebrate and value the contribution that volunteers make to enable us to be the organisation that we are today? And the roles that we create and publicise externally, again, emphasise not only that we understand the positive role that volunteering plays and the value that we place upon it, but also the benefits it can bring to individuals that engage with us. The second, I think this is the most important one, and I'm going to labour this point, is flexibility. So all of the reading, all of the research, all of the studies that I've looked at over the past decade has indicated that people's lifestyles are changing. We have a sandwich generation who are currently providing support and care to elderly relatives, as well as helping out their children in relation to grandchildren and childcare. People's time is being squeezed. The opportunities for people to do different things is growing. And with all of these different pressures, squeeze is the time that people perceive they have that they are available to volunteer. The more flexible we can be around our volunteering offer, the more we can build things that are on the terms of the individual rather than the organisation, a point that Paul beautifully illustrated in his intro, the more likely we are to not only engage people in volunteering, but to encourage them to continue to support us into the medium and longer term. And then the final thing is around inclusivity. We know, looking at volunteering profiles and demographics, that it's not the most diverse population. Some of that is about whether people perceive themselves to be volunteers, and Nicola talked earlier about language of volunteering and it being an anathema for some, but some of it is about the way in which we look to engage people, about how inclusive the cultures are that we have, around how we recognise difference, celebrate it, and enable people to be themselves and bring their whole selves when they come to volunteer with us. Some of it's about our existing volunteers and the cultures that they have, and that, you know, a lot of people volunteer for social benefit and social connection, which is a great strength, but if manifested incorrectly, could potentially become a weakness in that it could provide a barrier to other people wanting to integrate and to engage within the group. So we're really focused on how do we create an environment where everyone who volunteers with us feels both safe but also feels welcomed and valued for their contribution. So, conscious of time, I hope that's helpful. I will definitely share with you a whole wealth of information afterwards you can digest at your leisure. But yeah, that's all from me. Back to you, Lucy.
That's great, Tiger. Thank you very much. I think that's a really good way, sort of reflecting different approaches. So, in a sense, lots of thought and research, but also trying to turn it into something very real and practical for people. I think there's some themes coming out of all this, and I think rather than I don't have any specific questions for you, Tiger, but I think there are lots of issues. There's some themes coming out of all of this, which I think we might want to explore. Themes about community and kind of community-based volunteering, something about reflecting the needs of people's lives to be able to respond, and people to be able to have a flexible access to volunteering. And I think issues also about how people move from different roles. One stage you could be a volunteer, another stage you might be a volunteer manager. And actually, one thing we haven't explored a lot, but actually, I think the whole world of volunteers managing or supporting other volunteers. We now have the option of moving into breakout groups, which will not have very long. We've got probably 1/4 of an hour max for the breakout groups, but I think it is a chance to have a conversation amongst ourselves in a slightly smaller way. So can I suggest the most obvious thing, very briefly introduce yourself with name and organisation and share experience. And there are some questions that people may want to pick up in their groups, which are coming through on the chat around some of these issues. And then particularly it'd be good if there's some questions you want to put to the panel. So at the end, I'll ensure that the panel have a chance to answer some of the key questions. So if nothing else, it'd be really good if each group could have a question to put to the panel. And finally, if for any reason your group doesn't work, could you just take the number of your group? You'll be being put into a group by Rebecca now, by colleagues at MPC. And if your group doesn't work for any reason, then go back to the main group and she'll reallocate you. So off you go and please enjoy. I'll call you back in a 1/4 of an hour at 5:45. So good to see you all back. We had a short but rather good, I thought, conversation in my group. So I hope other people had a good conversation in theirs. And I hope that as a result of that, there might be some, not necessarily even questions, but just maybe things they want to throw into the wider group. So does anybody have any comments, questions, contributions they'd like to share with the wider group that maybe our panel members could respond to? So I'll tell you what, Chris Johnson, yeah. Could you unmute, Chris? I can't hear you. Can anybody hear him? No, we still can't hear you, I'm afraid. I tell you what, are you still with us, Chris? We can't hear you at all, I'm afraid. Oh, there we go.
Any better?
Yes, much better.
Right. No, the topic we were talking about was access to training.
Yeah.
I'm involved with one group where we're working with deaf young people. And I was just explaining that if we want to take them out for, say, an outdoor activity, we're going to need people trained in sign language, somebody who can drive a minibus, somebody who's got outdoor leadership skills, and they're all quite specialist skills that cost a lot, and yet you can't get access to training funds from the Education and Skills Funding Agency because of their minimum contract with £500,000. And I just wondered if any of the panel, I mean, Paul Reddish did specifically refer to training and support and enabling people to do things. What's their take on how we can make access to training more of a reality for volunteers?
Yeah, great question. Paul, I'm going to, because I know it's something that Volunteering Matters and its predecessors always been really committed to, the idea that everybody should have access to the opportunity to volunteer.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, Paul.
Okay, good. Sorry, so, I mean, this is one of the opportunities that we talked about, sort of, if we can think about things holistically as a sector, and it's been called passporting, various other things, but there's a bit of a law of diminishing returns with things like passporting. So in the context of people who just want to go and help out, and there doesn't need to be a lot of, actually it's easier for people just to move around. But the scenario that you've just described, Chris, the entry points for an organisation like yours are really high. So if there are things we can do around particular specialisms where we need to collect volunteers and how that can sort of come together, that has to be an area where we do a bit of work and identify where they are. And I mean, we could take many examples. You could look at the work for, think of some higher profile ones, the work that Samaritans and Childline do, and they'll all have their own separate training, and and that aspect and the entry levels to that. And you often hear with charities that have big cost barriers or big training and resourcing barriers, the need to get a year's commitment as a minimum to want to shoulder those costs. And then that sits counter to what Tiger's just shared, which is, it's going to put most people off. So, the more we can do in terms of creative thinking coming together as the sector to address these things, the better. I would love for there to be some government investment in this, Chris. I agree with that. I think we're a bit of a way off that yet, although, as I said, there's more political awareness now of volunteering, and I think these are conversations we can start to have again under the Kruger report around what are the barriers and what could government do to support these things. But I do think there's much more we can be doing together as well. And I think we can do that independent of government in starting to think about how we come together around the thematic issues and where we might be able to pool our resources to sort of service what volunteers' needs are and our own needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something also about which sort of came up in the group I was in, which is how we can, in a sense, use the confidence and expertise within the sector to share. So whether we could work, a number of deaf organisations could work together to try and develop some of this, because I think a lot of people some of them will already do some kind of volunteering. So I think that's would be well worth doing. I've got another question, which is, how do you find volunteers who are prepared to support with things indirectly related to achieving your charity's mission? So this is the sort of classic, actually, fundraising, digital and more. In many cases, of course, people suggest that's what you should have a trustee for. So you get yourself your digital trustee or your techie trustee, and you get yourself your finance trustee to help you, who may or may not be able to help you with fundraising, or you get yourself a very rich trustee to help you with fundraising. But do people have, I mean, there are some organisations, I think it's worth saying, who do focus on, in a sense, attracting either technical or professional skills, but I don't know if anybody wants to respond on that of the speakers. I don't know if that's something that any of you've got a view on.
Hi, Lucy, I'm happy to pick that one up. I think so. I think you're right. There are organisations out there like Good People that are prioritised and focused around skilled volunteering. What they found is actually the issue lies more with the charities rather than the demand. So the demand exists. The people are out there who are interested in coming and offering their time to support and utilise their skills. The challenge is that we do not provide the right level of supply. So it might be that culturally there's a barrier or a risk around, we're not going to get a high quality product because from someone supporting us on a pro bono basis. And I think there's a need for us to shift our mentality when we're thinking about skilled volunteering and positioning it more as pro bono rather than positioning it as, as a volunteering role, because unfortunately from a language perspective, there are some unhelpful connotations around the term volunteering being linked to amateur, and that all being completely wrong. So I think the legal profession have got it right. So how do we do more of that, positioning these as pro bono opportunities to support our organisation by using and deploying your technical skills?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some cases that will then transfer into people who want to be trustees as well, because that's another whole side to it. Okay, are there any other questions? Wait a minute. Got one here. Which goes, oh dear, this is about, I'm very passionate that we in the sector get better at calculating the financial value of our volunteer labour. Oh dear, we've done lots of that in the past. General volunteer labour is not included in our financial statements and published accounts, and thus the sector's reliance on volunteers is often missed. We hear the cost of the vaccination programme, but it excludes, yeah, that's a good point, the cost of the voluntary labour. Government listens to pounds. Yes, I mean, there has been work done in the past on the value of volunteering. Again, I don't know if that's something Tiger or Nicola or anybody else wants to pick up. I mean, all I would say is that the other thing was worth doing is, so somebody here has responded, I think. Is it Alan Pickup? Do you want to just very briefly come in? Alan, are you there?
Yeah, sorry. I'm just saying that we always calculate the value of our volunteers' hours, and they're highlighted very largely in our annual reports at the AGM. We also have volunteer awards ceremonies quite every year, and give thanks and certificates to volunteers. We really highlight them.
Yeah. So I don't know whether MPC could pick this up. I know there has been work done in the past when I was a trustee of Join-In. This is another whole conversation post the Olympics. We did some work, in fact, I think with Pro Bono Economics on the value of volunteering. And one of those interesting things about Andy Haldane, who's the deputy head of the Bank of England, has talked about the value of volunteering to GDP and how we ought to kind of calculate it better. So there we go, somebody's flagging it up. I think it's right that at one level, you know, the value of everything and the price of everything and the value of nothing if you're not careful. But I also think it's worth to at least have some estimates of it. But I think it's not the golden answer to everything. Yeah, exactly. As Tiger says, there's lots of challenges about how you do that. But all good questions to explore. I'm conscious of the time, colleagues, and I think we'll pick up any of the other specific questions, and I'm sure the NPC team will be happy to respond both in the chat and to circulate things afterwards. Can you just nod, Matthew, then because I can see you, then I know that's the case. Brilliant, thank you. It's been a very wide-ranging conversation, and I don't want to summarize it too glibly, but it does seem to me there's two or three absolutely key things we've all agreed. One is that whilst it's been good to deflate, I think, some of the sort of rhetoric around millions more people volunteering, I thought what Paul said was really interesting. I think it is the case that there's a different culture around, which I think we all want to respond to, a culture about wanting volunteering to be more inclusive, wanting actually to maybe recognise that volunteering itself, although we can spend hours working out what the best language is, that volunteering itself can actually be quite exclusive for a lot of people, that actually a lot of people just want to do a good turn to somebody else. They want to help out, as in help on your doorstep. I think we've all recognised the importance of flexibility. And as we go forward and as the pandemic changes and reduces, hopefully, and we all get back to a new world of something different, we want to enable what I would see as the fantastic opportunity of volunteering, that reciprocity, to be available to more and more people, and to be available in a way that is genuinely inclusive. And I think that's both a challenge to us, but also something that I get the impression that people are enthusiastic about. And if there are other things, I'm sure that colleagues at MPC can respond to in terms of any of the sort of factual and documentary stuff. I'm sure they'll be very happy to do that. So thank you very much to the three speakers. I think we had a great contributions, that really fantastic. Thank you to you all for coming along and attending, coming along, if you see what I mean, to the Zoom. Thank you to the Clothworkers for sponsoring this and continuing to sponsor these sessions. a reminder, please do respond to the feedback that you'll be sent. And can you also ensure that if you have any specific issues you want, that NPC will respond to you? And can I also thank the team at NPC for putting this together, because I think it's been a really good session, and I found it actually quite encouraging and inspiring. So thank you all very much again for coming. I do hope you keep in touch one way or another, and thanks very much to you all. And hope that's been a good session, and go and have a nice, quiet, non-Zoom filled evening. Thank you.